Joining us now is Benjamin Ayanian. Benjamin is a young guy, a recent graduate of the University of Minnesota, a poli-sci and philosophy major there. And he's here to talk about the idea of taxing rich people to be able to buy more gifts for regular people who are drowning under debt. Benjamin, thanks for being here on WTIC.
Thank you for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
So California is considering a tax on the rich in order to help pay the bills. Is that what's going on?
California is staring down a major deficit at the moment, to the tune of $68 billion in 2024 and 2025. They were set to discuss a wealth tax as a means to help close that budget gap. The bill did stall in committee after Governor Newsom, strongly opposed the bill. But, it's safe to say that, wealth tax proposals will likely come back around at some point in California, and if not, in other states.
So you're a libertarian by nature, which is something I admire, and maybe you could lay out the case for us from a libertarian perspective for why this is an illegitimate idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few ways to, oppose a wealth tax, to make an argument against one. One is from the consequences of a wealth tax, which I can get into in a little bit. But from a libertarian standpoint, I would look at opposing a wealth tax from a more principles-based position, and that there's a couple facets to that. So for one, a wealth tax would violate the idea of the rule of law. This notion that individuals should be treated equally under the law, and that the government should not work to benefit or work to the detriment of specific groups. That laws are supposed to be neutral in terms of group benefit. There should be no idea of group benefit in legislation. And then also this idea of using a wealth tax to help pay for more goodies from the government, either to prop up failing programs, which is often the case in a state like California, or just to increase lavish spending programs that aren't necessary. So as citizens, we don't have any right to receive gifts from the government. There's no inherent right that we have for the government to give us goodies. On the other hand, we do have a right to our own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which includes our right to our own property. And so from a libertarian standpoint, it would be immoral to violate the rule of law and target only the rich and take their property using coercion. After all taxes are backed by coercion because we elicit compliance with the implicit threat of fines, imprisonment, or violence at the hands of government. And so what a wealth tax does is it uses coercion to target a specific group, in this case the wealthy, to take their property, which is their wealth, and to use it to, in the case of California,
to buy votes,
prop up failing programs.
Yeah, so this is really the most important problem that generally doesn't come into the political conversations. That is that they use the money to break our system of government by building loyal voters out of people in exchange for the cash that they give them. And this is really the whole premise of our government now, is trying to give things to their voters. I feel like the only kind of public policy they do is vote rigging schemes.
The more money that the government doles out, whether that's your local government or the federal government, the more money there is to be captured by private interests, the more rent seeking that we'll have going on. And rent seeking is when individuals employ the government to do their bidding, whether it is to fund their various efforts or to impose regulations that keep out competition, whatever it may be. But the more active our federal government or local governments are, from a fiscal standpoint, the more opportunity there will be for private interests to employ the government to their own ends. And that's often not thought about in the public conversation when politicians get on their platform and their soapboxes talking about how their spending is going to fix XYZ problem or benefit, XYZ group that is struggling. Lost in that conversation is often two ideas. One, that to hand out favors, the government has to take money from other people. And then secondly is that the more money they're doling out, the more risk there is for abuse.
Yeah, well, to me, that's why it's the most important thing, because it really breaks our system of government. Who was that famous person? Was it de Tocqueville who came to America and said, when he looked at it, he laughed and said, well, that will be good until the voters realize they can demand anything in response to their vote? Or was that Ben Franklin? Where did that come from?
I believe you were right on the first one. Not 100% sure off the top of my head, but it's a very salient point. You know, the more the government becomes involved in those sort of schemes, and as you said, breaks our system of governance, the more the government becomes a tool that we all fight over in order to benefit ourselves. And
yes, which also locks us into binary voting. That is, we can only vote for these two parties, and we have to pick the one that's best for us, and vote against the other guy because he's bad for us.
Absolutely, and a big problem with that is that each election, especially as we talk from a federal standpoint, is the federal government usurps more power, and as the federal government doles out more money and becomes more active in economic affairs and in all different facets of life, not just in economic ways. But the more the federal government becomes involved in our lives, the more consequential every election becomes in the minds of each voter. Because, you know, you have to vote for these two, like, as you said, we've come to a place where it seems you can only choose between these two baskets. And they're going to be radically different than one another. And on top of that, the federal government is involved in so many areas of American life that it does almost become more consequential who becomes president. You know, if you are a Democrat or a Republican, you might really overreact to the other side per se winning an election, because if the government has that much power, it really does affect, you know, all the things that you care about a lot, who wins.
We're talking to Benjamin Ayanian. He is a graduate of the University of Minnesota, and he is a libertarian, which I find appealing because I think our escape from this is getting everybody to understand that having a liberty-based system is the great innovation of the American system of government, and having our political class throw that away in favor of taking money without a legitimate premise for taking it so that they can redistribute it. That's a communist system. That's not our system. And they're using it to break our system and ruin our elections. And I think that's why everybody's so frustrated.
It's definitely a big cause of frustration. I'm sure you hear, you know, every election. I've written about before how we're told constantly on TV, we're told in news articles, we're told that you know, this election, whatever the next election is, we're always told this is the most consequential election in American history. And while that is, you know, obviously it's hyperbole used to scare individuals into voting for their side, to some degree, it has a little bit of truth to it every time we go further down the line of giving the government more power over our lives. And so that is why, you know, a liberty-based system is more important. You know, the government is moving in a direction where it's wanting to bestow positive rights on people. And a positive right would be something that I receive from the government. If a progressive says you have a right to health care, that is a positive right in the sense that they are bestowing something on me. But
which means it's not a right in our system of government and our understanding of what a right is.
Right, exactly. And so in the United States, in the ideals of the United States founding, right, we only have what are called negative rights. And as a libertarian, I only believe in negative rights, which are rights to non-interference. So like I said earlier, I have a right to my life, liberty, property, and pursuit of happiness. Those are all negative rights, meaning I have a right for other people. My right is that other people cannot infringe upon those things.
How did you're a young guy, how did you fall into this belief system?
It was a bit of a journey. When I first got to undergrad in 2018, it was, I was kind of a blank slate politically. My family didn't talk politics much. I knew they had, voted for both parties throughout their lifetime. And my school, the University of Minnesota, is an incredibly progressive school. I was getting a lot of progressive messaging from professors and student groups, and it really turned me off. And so for a minute, I was actually pushed more into the conservative camp. But then I found out, in a lot of ways, conservatives also want to use the power of the state to benefit their friends and harm their enemies. And so I started reading, people like Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman, and ultimately libertarians like Friedrich Hayek and Robert Nozick. And ultimately, became convinced that, liberty-based systems, looking at principles and people's rights instead of, trying to use the state as a means to engender certain outcomes is a much better way of governance that respects the rights of individuals.
Is your read of the Constitution that's really what was intended by those principles laid out in the Declaration and the founding documents?
Absolutely, I think the Declaration of Independence was a very monumental founding document, and the United States Constitution. I think both were intended to protect individual liberties, and the founders, they had varying beliefs and varying principles. Even Madison, who we're often told was an anti-majoritarian. Madison believed actually that, for example, majorities ultimately would rule, and that they probably ought to. But what he believed in our system of governance was this idea of speed bumps. Not allowing temporary impassioned majorities to make rules, and that's why we have all these checks and balances. But something that does run constant among many of the founders is this idea of protecting individual liberty and individual rights, and I think that libertarianism is pretty consistent with those principles.
Benjamin Ayanian is a contributor for a place called Young Voices. It's a talent agency for young pro-liberty commentators. It's a cool thing. Do you have anything you want to promote to people or say before you leave?
Yeah, I mean, I would love for many of your listeners to follow me on Twitter at Benjamin Ayanian, and also check out, the Young Voices social media pages. There's great commentators in our organization.
Benjamin, thank you so much for being here. Fun to talk with you.
Thanks for having me on.
All righty. Benjamin Ayanian, Ayanian.